Hey guys, tonight, let the room become a little quieter. Dim the lights if you can, settle into whatever feels comfortable, and let your shoulders loosen. If you enjoy these slow journeys through the past, you can quietly leave a like, subscribe, or tell me where you're listening from. Then forget about all of that, because there is nowhere you need to be tonight. Just breathe slowly. Imagine the Nile Valley several thousand years ago. The sun has disappeared behind the western horizon, leaving a faint bronze glow above the river. Across the fields, the last workers have returned home. Water buffalo and cattle settle into their enclosures. Somewhere nearby, a reed boat rests against the muddy bank, barely moving as the dark water passes beneath it. The great temples are quieter now. Their courtyards, so busy during daylight, have become enormous shadows beneath the stars. For an Egyptian household, this was the hour when ordinary life gradually folded itself away. A meal had been eaten. Tools had been put aside. A small space had been prepared for sleep, and yet sleep was not always regarded as the harmless, peaceful thing we imagine today. For many ancient Egyptians, the night occupied a strange position between the familiar world and everything that could not be easily seen. Daylight belonged to human activity. You could see your home, your family, your animals, the river, the fields. You could recognize what stood before you. A night was different. When the household became still, the boundaries between the visible and invisible world seemed less certain. An Egyptian might lie down on a woven sleeping mat beneath a roof of reeds, mud brick, or plaster. The air would slowly cool. The smell of bread, smoke, oil, and Nile mud would linger around the room. Someone might whisper a final prayer. Someone else might check the doorway. Then the household would become quiet. The sleeper closed their eyes, and something remarkable happened. The body remained in the room, but the mind could travel somewhere else. Ancient Egyptians had a complex understanding of the soul, dreams, death, and the unseen world. They did not simply divide existence into waking life and nothingness. Their religious traditions allowed for several aspects of a person to continue beyond ordinary physical existence. That made sleep fascinating. It also made it unsettling. A dream could feel like a message, a nightmare could seem more meaningful than an unpleasant thought, and the darkness itself could become a time when invisible beings, supernatural forces, or disturbances might approach the sleeping person. This did not mean every Egyptian climbed into bed trembling with terror. Life was usually more practical than that. People still had children to feed, bread to bake, fields to tend, and animals to care for in the morning, but beneath those ordinary routines was a quiet awareness. Sleep carried a mystery. The person who closed their eyes could not see what surrounded them. They could not know what their mind might encounter, and, perhaps most importantly, they could not simply assume that every dream was meaningless. So as the Nile moved slowly through the darkness, Egyptian homes settled into silence. A small headrest waited beside a sleeping place. An amulet might lie within reach. A protective word might be spoken before the eyes finally closed, and above the rooftops, the stars remained perfectly still, while, inside the sleeping household, another world was about to begin. The last traces of daylight have almost disappeared now. Across the Nile Valley, the colors of evening slowly surrender to darkness. What had been a landscape of gold and green becomes a quieter arrangement of palms, fields, mud brick walls, and distant temple roofs. For a short while, there is a gentle pause between day and night. The heat remains trapped in the walls of the houses, while the ground begins to cool beneath bare feet. Along the river bank, insects gather over the water. A donkey gives a tired call somewhere beyond the houses, and from another courtyard comes the faint sound of pottery being moved into its place. Then even those sounds begin to thin. Ancient Egypt was a land deeply shaped by the rhythm of the sun. Daylight was useful in a very practical sense. It revealed paths, animals, people, tools, and hazards. Farmers could see the irrigation channels beneath their feet. Fishermen could read the surface of the river. Children could play beneath the watchful eyes of adults. At night, all of this changed. There was no electric glow spilling across streets or illuminating distant buildings. Artificial light was precious and limited. An ordinary household depended mainly on small lamps filled with oil, their flames modest enough to illuminate only a portion of a room. Imagine stepping outside one of these homes after sunset. Your eyes would need time to adjust. The nearest wall might be visible only as a darker shape against the night. Beyond it, the settlement would dissolve into patches of shadow. A familiar path could suddenly seem uncertain. The Nile itself would become difficult to distinguish from the darkness surrounding it, and above everything would stretch an enormous sky. The Egyptians were careful observers of the heavens. Stars were not merely decorations overhead. They formed part of the religious and practical understanding of the world. The movement of celestial bodies could be watched across generations, becoming woven into calendars, rituals, and beliefs about the divine order. At night, therefore, the sky could feel both reassuring and distant. The stars remained where they were supposed to be. Human beings, meanwhile, disappeared into darkness. Inside a small home, preparations for sleep continued without much ceremony. A woman might finish arranging food for the following morning. A man might place a tool against the wall. Children would gradually become quiet, their voices fading beneath the murmuring conversation of adults. Someone might pour a little more oil into a lamp. The flame would rise briefly, then settle. The room would glow again, softly. There was nothing theatrical about this moment. That is precisely what makes it interesting. Fear of the night, where it existed, did not necessarily announce itself with screams or sudden panic. It could appear as caution, a habit of checking a doorway, keeping a protective object nearby, or speaking a familiar religious formula before settling down. Darkness simply changed the conditions of ordinary life. A person who had spent the afternoon walking confidently through a village now had to depend upon memory. A familiar courtyard became a place of indistinct shapes. A noise outside could not immediately be explained. Perhaps it was an animal, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps the wind moving through reeds. When vision disappeared, imagination had more room to work. This was especially important in a culture where the unseen world was not considered imaginary in the modern sense. Gods, spirits, protective forces, and dangerous supernatural beings belonged to a larger religious understanding of existence. Night therefore carried a different atmosphere, not necessarily terror, but uncertainty. As families gradually laid down, the Nile continued its patient movement beyond the walls. The lamps burned lower, the voices stopped, and somewhere between the final moments of waking and the first drifting images of sleep, the darkness became more than an absence of sunlight. It became a threshold, a place where the ordinary rules of the day seemed to loosen, just enough for an Egyptian sleeper to wonder what might exist on the other side of closed eyes. The village has disappeared into darkness now, and the small lamps that once seemed important have become little islands of warmth. Beyond their circles of light, the night continues without interruption. Inside one quiet Egyptian home, a sleeper shifts gently on a woven mat. The room is still. The sounds of the household have almost completely vanished, leaving only the occasional movement of someone breathing nearby, the faint rustle of reeds, and perhaps the distant call of an animal. Beyond the walls, then the sleeper closes their eyes. For us, this can feel like the simplest action in the world. For an ancient Egyptian, it could carry a deeper meaning. Sleep was not necessarily understood as an empty period in which nothing happened. Egyptian ideas about the person were complex, and the individual was thought to contain several connected aspects of existence. The body was one part of the story, but identity could also involve the Ka, the Ba, the heart, the name, and other spiritual dimensions. These ideas belong to a religious world where death itself was not considered the complete end of a person, so when an Egyptian fell asleep, the boundary between ordinary physical life and the unseen could feel unusually thin. Imagine lying beneath a simple linen covering. The air is cooler now. The smell of the day's cooking has faded, replaced by dry earth and the faint scent of oil from the lamp. You know the room around you. You know where the doorway is. You know where the household objects have been placed. Yet your eyes are closed. The familiar world begins to disappear. First the walls become meaningless, then the room itself seems to dissolve. Thoughts arrive without being invited. A face appears. A landscape changes. A dead relative may seem to return. A god may appear in a dream. A strange animal might wander through an impossible landscape. None of this required a person to believe that every dream came directly from a deity, but dreams could still be taken seriously. Ancient Egyptian sources preserve evidence that dreams were sometimes regarded as significant experiences. People could seek interpretations, record dreams, or treat particular dream experiences as potential messages or warnings. This gave sleep a peculiar quality. A person could enter bed as an ordinary farmer, craft worker, parent, child, or official, and wake having experienced something that seemed to belong to an entirely different realm. There was also another unsettling detail. The sleeper could not control the boundary. You could prepare the bed, you could arrange protective objects, you could speak words of protection, but once your eyes closed, you surrendered awareness of the room. That loss of control was part of what made sleep mysterious. A person could be surrounded by family and still enter a private world that no one else could see. Someone sleeping beside you might hear your breathing, but they could not follow your dream. They could not see the people you encountered. They could not know what images moved through your mind. And when morning finally arrived, the dream might remain vivid for a few moments before slowly dissolving into ordinary memory. Perhaps the sleeper would describe it over breakfast. Perhaps they would say nothing. Perhaps an unusual dream would remain in their thoughts throughout the day. Egyptian religious traditions also connected dreams with the larger world of gods, temples, and supernatural forces. Certain texts and practices reveal an interest in dreams as experiences capable of carrying meaning. The night, then, was not simply the opposite of daytime. It was a different condition of existence. During daylight, a person moved through a world of visible objects. During sleep, the mind could move through places that had no physical location at all, and that distinction could be strangely comforting. The darkness outside no longer needed to be completely empty. There might be something beyond it, something unseen, something waiting quietly behind the curtain of sleep. For an Egyptian lying beneath the stars, closing the eyes could therefore feel less like switching off the world, and more like opening a door without knowing who might be waiting on the other side. The first pale light of morning has not yet reached the village, but the sleeper has already returned from somewhere distant. For a few moments, the room feels unfamiliar. The woven mat is beneath the body again. The wall is where it should be. The doorway is quiet. Somewhere outside, the Nile continues its slow movement through the darkness, yet the dream remains. Perhaps there was a face in it, perhaps a place, perhaps only a strange feeling that refuses to disappear. For the ancient Egyptians, this uncertain space between ordinary awareness and the world of dreams could be deeply meaningful. Their religious imagination did not draw a simple line between what could be touched and what could not. The visible world was only part of existence, and sleep offered a peculiar opportunity to experience what normally remained hidden. Imagine an Egyptian household several thousand years ago. Long after everyone has settled down, a father sleeps near the wall, a child lies beside a relative. The smallest sounds of the house have become almost impossible to notice. Then, somewhere inside the sleeping mind, the familiar world changes. The walls are gone. The Nile is suddenly somewhere else. A person who was alive yesterday may appear as though they have simply walked into the room. A temple might stand beneath an unfamiliar sky, a bird could speak, a god might appear without warning. The dream does not explain itself, it simply happens. This is one reason dreams could occupy such an interesting position in Egyptian thought. A dream was private, but it could also seem strangely external. The dreamer did not consciously design every detail. Images arrived on their own, carrying the authority of something encountered rather than something deliberately invented. That distinction mattered. If an Egyptian woke from an ordinary pleasant dream, there might be little reason to dwell on it. But a vivid or disturbing dream could remain in the mind long after breakfast. What had caused it? Was it merely the result of the day's experiences? Was it connected to the gods? Was it a warning, or had the sleeper somehow encountered something beyond the ordinary world? There was no single answer that explained every dream. Egyptian religious traditions developed different ways of understanding divine communication, supernatural influence, and the experiences of sleeping people. Dreams could therefore become objects of attention, interpretation, and sometimes concern. But there was another side to the mystery. Sleep made a person temporarily helpless. During the day, you could respond to a strange sound, you could turn toward an approaching animal, you could leave a room if something seemed wrong. During deep sleep, the body remained still, the eyes were closed, the surrounding world continued without your awareness. That simple fact could make the night feel different. A person might lie safely among family members and still enter an experience that belonged entirely to them. No one else could follow, no one else could correct the dream while it was happening, and when the sleeper finally opened their eyes, the experience could vanish almost immediately. This strange relationship between helplessness and imagination may help explain why sleep carried such symbolic importance. Death, too, involved a departure from ordinary awareness. The Egyptian world was filled with careful ideas about what happened after physical life, including journeys, judgment, transformation, and continued existence. Sleep was not identical to death. Of course, an Egyptian would wake again, but the temporary separation from ordinary awareness offered a small reminder of something larger. The body could remain here, while the mind appeared to travel elsewhere, outside the sleeping chamber. The stars slowly moved across the heavens. The night passed one quiet hour at a time. Inside, dreams came and went without footsteps, without doors opening, without anyone watching, and perhaps that was the most mysterious part of all. The realm beyond closed eyes did not need to be frightening to feel powerful. It only needed to remain unknown, because once the eyelids lowered, even a familiar Egyptian home could become the entrance to a place where the rules of daylight no longer seemed quite so certain. The morning has arrived quietly. But the memory of darkness has not completely disappeared. For the Egyptian who had awakened from an unusual dream, the question could linger: what had actually been present during those hours when the household was asleep? The answer depended greatly on the person's beliefs, circumstances, and the tradition surrounding them. Ancient Egyptian religion contained a wide variety of supernatural beings, and not all of them belonged neatly to the categories of good or evil that modern stories often prefer. Some beings were protective, others could be dangerous, some were connected with particular places, illnesses, dreams, or moments of vulnerability. Night was one of those moments. Once the sun had vanished, people were no longer surrounded by the reassuring activity of daylight. A person lying alone in darkness could become vulnerable to forces that could not be seen. The Egyptians had names for many supernatural beings, though the modern word demon can sometimes make their beliefs sound simpler than they really were. One important figure associated with dangerous nighttime encounters was Apep, the enormous serpent who opposed the sun god during the nightly journey through the underworld. Apep was not simply a monster hiding beneath someone's bed. He belonged to a much larger cosmic struggle involving the sun's journey and the continuing order of creation. Other supernatural beings appeared in Egyptian religious texts and magical traditions as more localized threats. There were entities associated with illness, death, wandering spirits, and disturbances, and then there were the beings people feared precisely because their intentions were uncertain. Imagine a small Egyptian household after midnight. The oil lamp has nearly burned down. The family is sleeping. A child turns beneath a linen covering. The mother hears a faint sound from outside. She sits up. For a moment, she listens. Nothing. The sound may have been an animal moving through the courtyard. It may have been reeds brushing against one another in the breeze, but in darkness, uncertainty becomes its own sensation. She reaches toward a protective object kept nearby. Perhaps it is an amulet, perhaps a small figure associated with a protective deity. She touches it almost absent-mindedly, the way someone today might reach for a familiar object when waking from an unpleasant dream. Then she lies down again. This kind of behavior helps reveal something important about Egyptian ideas of supernatural danger. Protection was not always dramatic. Much of it was woven into ordinary life. Words could protect, objects could protect, images of gods could protect, certain names could protect. Even the arrangement of a sleeping space might reflect a desire to keep danger away. The household did not need to become a temple at midnight. A person could simply keep something meaningful close. Among the figures associated with protection was Biz, a distinctive deity usually shown with a broad, somewhat unusual appearance and a reputation for guarding households, childbirth, children, and vulnerable moments. Images of Biz became especially familiar in domestic contexts. His presence could be reassuring precisely because he belonged so naturally to the household world. There were also magical spells intended to defend people from supernatural harm. Some surviving Egyptian texts contain protective formulas against beings that could attack or trouble a person. These traditions reveal an interesting attitude toward the unseen. The solution was not always to understand everything. Sometimes it was enough to have protection. A person could admit, in effect, that there were things beyond ordinary knowledge, and still believe there were ways to remain safe. As the night continued, the sleeping household would know none of this consciously. A child might dream without remembering, an adult might shift beneath a linen sheet, the lamp might finally go dark. Outside, the stars would remain steady above the Nile. Invisible beings were imagined to move through the darkness. They left no footprints in the courtyard. That was part of their power. They could not be easily observed. They belong to the uncertain territory between waking and dreaming. Between ordinary illness and supernatural explanation, between what a person could see and what they believed might be waiting just beyond sight, and with that uncertainty came a simple human instinct, the desire to place something protective between yourself and the unknown. The night has grown deeper, and inside the quiet household, protection has become something small enough to hold in the palm of a hand, an amulet. Perhaps it rests beside a sleeping mat, perhaps it hangs from a cord, perhaps it has been worn throughout the day and only removed when the sleeper settles down. To modern eyes, such an object might appear modest, a little figure, a carved symbol, a bead, or a small piece of material shaped with care. But in ancient Egypt, an amulet could carry an importance far greater than its physical size suggested. The Egyptians used amulets in many settings and for many purposes. Some were associated with health, protection, fertility, childbirth, death, or the afterlife. Their meanings varied, and their use changed across different periods and circumstances. What mattered was the relationship between the object and the power it represented. Imagine a woman preparing her sleeping place at the end of a long day. She has already washed, the day's clothing has been loosened, the household is quiet. Before lying down, she reaches toward a small object kept near her sleeping mat. It might be a simple bead or a carved figure. She turns it once between her fingers. There is nothing remarkable about the movement. No ceremony is required. The object has simply become part of the rhythm of ordinary life. She places it beside her. Then she lies down. The amulet remains there through the darkness. Some amulets were shaped like gods or protective figures. Others carried recognizable symbols such as the wedjat eye, a powerful sign associated with healing, restoration, and protection. The scarab was another important symbol. Associated with the sun's daily renewal and the movement of the heavens, it became especially significant in funerary traditions. For someone lying down at night, however, protection could be more immediate. The concern might not be death thousands of years in the future. It could be tonight, a nightmare, an illness, a strange presence, a vulnerable child. The Egyptians did not separate everyday life from religious meaning as sharply as modern people sometimes do. Objects used around the home could carry spiritual significance while remaining completely ordinary in appearance. A protective figure could sit among household belongings. A pendant could hang around someone's neck, a small object could rest beneath clothing, and a charm could accompany a person into sleep. This made the bedroom, or sleeping area, a fascinating place. There was rarely much furniture. A woven mat might provide the main sleeping surface, a wooden headrest could support the head, a linen covering might protect against cool air and insects. Nearby, however, there might be something whose purpose was not physical comfort at all. It was there for reassurance. The distinction matters. An amulet could not make the floor softer, it could not lower the temperature, it could not guarantee a dreamless night. Its purpose belonged to another level of experience. It represented protection against things that could not be handled with ordinary tools. The sleeper might never consciously think about it after placing it beside the mat. That was not necessarily a failure. Protection could become habitual, like closing a door, like covering a lamp, like placing food where it would be ready in the morning. The object simply belonged there. In wealthy households, amulets could be made from valuable materials, including faience, stone, metal, or precious substances. In humbler homes, protective objects could be much simpler. The difference in wealth did not necessarily erase the desire for protection. Everyone eventually had to close their eyes, everyone eventually entered darkness, and everyone knew that sleep made the body unusually still, so the small object waited beside the sleeper. Perhaps it carried an image of a protective deity, perhaps it represented healing. Perhaps its meaning had been explained by a parent years earlier. Perhaps the person using it understood only part of its significance. That was enough. Outside, the night remained vast. Inside, a tiny object rested quietly beside the bed. It did not glow, it did not move, it simply occupied its place, a small reminder that, even in the darkness, the sleeper was not entirely without protection. The little amulet remains where it was placed, quiet and motionless beside the sleeping mat, but an object was not always the only form of protection. Sometimes protection was carried in words. As the household prepared for another night, a person might speak a short prayer, invocation, or magical formula intended to keep danger away. These words belong to a world in which language itself could possess power. For the ancient Egyptians, writing and speech were not merely ways of describing reality. Names mattered, words mattered. To speak something correctly could be more than communication. It could become an act. This idea appears throughout Egyptian religious and magical traditions. Where formulas were used for protection, healing, funerary purposes, and contact with divine powers, not every bedtime involved an elaborate recitation. Most people were living ordinary lives, not performing ceremonies every evening, yet protective words could become part of the habit surrounding vulnerable moments, and sleep was certainly one of them. Picture a quiet household near the Nile. The day's work has ended. A small meal has been finished. The sleeping mats have been arranged. An oil lamp burns low beside the wall. A child lies beneath a linen covering while an older family member sits nearby. The adult leans closer. The words are spoken quietly. There is no theatrical voice. No raised arms, no dramatic gesture, just a low recitation in a room where everyone else is becoming still. The exact words spoken by ordinary people at bedtime are rarely preserved for us. Ancient Egyptian magical and religious texts survive in many forms, but they do not provide a simple diary of what every household said before sleeping. That uncertainty is important. It reminds us that the real lives of ancient people were always more varied than surviving texts suggest. Some protective formulas were probably highly specialized, others may have been adapted from religious traditions and passed through families. A person might know only a few words, another might possess a more elaborate ritual, a priest could have access to texts and knowledge unavailable to an ordinary household. Still, the basic idea remained. Powerful words could create protection. This was especially significant when dealing with invisible dangers. You could not physically lock a door against a nightmare. You could not place a fence around a dream. You could not inspect the darkness for every supernatural threat imagined by the culture, but you could speak, and speaking gave the sleeper something to do. The voice itself could become an act of reassurance. Perhaps a mother recited words over her child. Perhaps someone whispered a familiar invocation before lying down. Perhaps the words were spoken toward an amulet, reinforcing the protection it represented. The room remained unchanged. The lamp still flickered, the walls still stood around the family, yet the atmosphere could feel different. There is something deeply human about this. Across history, people have used words to make uncertain moments feel more manageable. A phrase repeated before a journey, a blessing spoken over a child, a prayer before sleep. The Egyptians were no exception. Their religious world was filled with divine names and carefully preserved formulas because the spoken word could participate in maintaining order. The universe itself was understood through ideas of balance, order, and proper existence. Against that background, protective speech made sense. It was a way of placing the sleeper within an ordered world before entering the uncertainty of sleep. Outside the house, the night continued. The Nile reflected the stars, a breeze moved through reeds along the water. Somewhere in the darkness, an animal crossed a path and disappeared again. Inside, the final words faded into silence. The person who had spoken them did not suddenly know what the night would bring. No formula could make the future completely visible, but perhaps certainty was never the purpose. The purpose was to lie down with the feeling that something had been done. The amulet was in place, the words had been spoken, the lamp remained nearby, and slowly, as the voice disappeared into the darkness, the household returned to stillness, leaving the sleeper with one final sound before the long silence of the night. The final words have faded, and the room has become quiet once more. The sleeper lowers their head, and discovers that resting comfortably is not quite as simple as it sounds. A modern bed invites the body to sink into softness. An ancient Egyptian sleeping place offered something rather different. For many people, the main support beneath the head was not a soft pillow at all, but a wooden headrest. At first glance, it can seem almost impossibly uncomfortable. A curved upper surface, a narrow central support, a broad base, that was enough. Headrests existed in Egypt for thousands of years and appeared in different forms and materials. Some were plain and practical. Others were carefully crafted and decorated, sometimes reflecting the owner's wealth or religious beliefs. They were not simply objects of luxury, they served a practical purpose. The raised head could help keep the face away from the floor, bedding, insects, and other small nighttime annoyances. In the hot Egyptian climate, a headrest could also allow air to circulate around the head more freely than a thick cushion would. Still, it took some getting used to. Imagine lying down after a long day of work. Your back is tired, your feet are tired, you expect sleep to arrive quickly, but beneath your head is a small wooden structure that does not yield when you move. You turn slightly, the headrest remains exactly where it was. You shift your neck, still there. Eventually, the body learns the position. Ancient Egyptians who regularly used headrests would have been accustomed to them in a way that might seem surprising to us. Children could grow up sleeping with them. Adults could use them for years, and yet the object tells us something important about ancient sleep. Rest did not necessarily mean comfort. A person could be exhausted and still sleep on a hard surface. The woven mat beneath the body offered little softness. The headrest supported the neck but did not surround the head. The linen covering protected against cool air and insects, but it could not transform the sleeping place into a modern mattress. Nighttime was simply another part of a life where the body adapted to its environment. The shape of the headrest itself was carefully designed. The curved top supported the head. The central column lifted it above the sleeping surface. The wide base provided stability. Some headrests were made from wood, while others could be produced from stone, faience, ivory, or other materials depending on period and status. Decoration could transform a practical object into something more personal. A wealthy person's headrest might be polished and carefully carved. A simpler household could use a much plainer version. Either way, the same basic purpose remained: keep the head raised, keep the body settled, make the night a little easier. There was also a curious symbolic dimension. Headrests could appear in funerary contexts, where they became associated with the protection and restoration of the deceased. This connection reveals how closely everyday objects and religious ideas could overlap. Something used for ordinary sleep could later appear in the world of death. The same basic shape could belong to both experiences. For an Egyptian, the transition from waking to sleeping was already surrounded by religious ideas. The headrest added another quiet reminder that the body itself needed protection. Imagine the room now. The oil lamp has almost disappeared. The sleeper has finally found a position that feels tolerable. The wooden headrest supports the neck, a woven mat rests beneath the body, the night air moves gently through the room. There is no soft mattress waiting underneath. There is only the familiar arrangement that generations have known, and perhaps that familiarity was comforting. We tend to imagine ancient people struggling constantly against their surroundings, but people become remarkably good at adapting. What looks uncomfortable to us can become ordinary to someone who has known nothing else. The sleeper shifts once more, then becomes still. The hard wooden support remains beneath the head, quietly doing its simple job. And as the room settles into darkness, even discomfort becomes part of the ritual of rest. The wooden headrest remains beneath the sleeper's neck, firm and familiar. Outside, the night continues its slow passage. For most people, sleep eventually becomes so ordinary that we stop thinking about what it means to surrender consciousness. We close our eyes because we expect to open them again, but that expectation is not guaranteed. For the ancient Egyptians, death was a constant part of the world around them. Tombs, funerary rituals, mummification, monuments, and prayers all reflected a culture deeply concerned with what happened when a person's breathing stopped and the body could no longer move. This did not mean Egyptians spent every night expecting death. Life was too busy for that. Fields still needed tending, bread still had to be baked, children still woke hungry, boats still needed loading along the Nile. Yet the connection between sleep and death could be felt through their similarities. A sleeping person lies still, a dead person lies still. A sleeper does not respond immediately, neither does a corpse. The difference is that one eventually opens their eyes, the other does not. Imagine an Egyptian household late at night. A father has gone to sleep. After a long day of work, his family knows the familiar rhythm of his breathing. For a while, nothing changes. Then one of the children wakes. The room is dark. The child listens. There is only silence. Perhaps the father is simply sleeping deeply. Perhaps he turns slightly beneath the linen covering. The child settles down again. But the moment contains something very human. The uncertainty of not knowing whether someone is merely asleep or has crossed into something permanent. Egyptian funerary beliefs were elaborate because death was not understood as simple disappearance. The deceased might continue to exist in another form, provided that the proper rituals, offerings, and protections were maintained. Names mattered, the body mattered, the tomb mattered, food offerings mattered, words mattered. All of these helped preserve the connection between the dead person and the world beyond physical life. This made waking from sleep especially precious. Morning was evidence of return. The sleeper had entered darkness and come back. The body had remained alive through the mysterious hours. The eyes opened, the room reappeared, the family was still there. That first moment of awareness could therefore carry a quiet reassurance, but before morning came, there remained the long interval when the sleeper had no control over time. Hours could pass without awareness. A person could fall asleep and feel as though only a few moments had passed before waking. The darkness might have lasted the entire night. The mind simply did not experience it continuously. This strange Disappearance of time could make sleep resemble a miniature journey away from ordinary existence. Egyptian religious traditions also contained ideas of renewal and rebirth. The daily return of the sun was itself a powerful symbol. Each evening, the sun disappeared into the western horizon. Each morning, it returned. Night was therefore not simply an ending, it was part of a cycle. The sun's disappearance could be followed by its renewal. Human life, however, was more fragile. A person could not assume that every darkness would be followed by another morning. Illness, accident, age, and countless ordinary dangers could interrupt that expectation, and ancient people understood this from experience. Perhaps this is why protective objects and spoken formulas could feel reassuring at bedtime. They could not promise immortality, but they offered a way of facing uncertainty. The sleeper could arrange the headrest, place an amulet nearby, speak a protective phrase, then lie down. The ritual did not remove the mystery, it simply made the mystery easier to accept. In the quiet room, the oil lamp gradually weakened. The sleeper's breathing remained steady. Outside, the stars continued their slow movement across the heavens. Nothing dramatic happened, and that is precisely how the fear of never waking might have existed, not as constant panic, but as a quiet awareness beneath ordinary life. Eventually, the eastern horizon would begin to brighten. For one more night, the darkness would give way to morning. And opening one's eyes could feel like the simplest proof that the journey had ended safely. Morning has come, and with it the ordinary reassurance of movement. Doors open, people step into the courtyards, bread is prepared, the Nile catches the first light of day. Yet for some Egyptians, the problems of the night did not simply disappear with sunrise. A troubling dream could remain in the mind long after the sleeper had awakened, and when a dream seemed unusually vivid, frightening, or significant, a person might seek help from someone believed to understand the unseen world. This is where priests, ritual specialists, and people skilled in magical practices could become important. It is tempting to imagine an Egyptian priest as someone who spent every night walking through dark corridors, protecting sleeping households from monsters. Reality was much quieter. Religious specialists performed many different duties. They served in temples, maintained sacred images, carried out rituals, recited formulas, and participated in ceremonies connected with gods and the dead. Some also possessed knowledge of protective magic. In Egyptian culture, religion and magic were not always separated as neatly as modern categories suggest. A spoken formula could be religious, a ritual could also be protective. An object could have both practical and sacred meaning, so imagine someone arriving at a temple after experiencing several disturbing nights. They do not rush through the doorway. The temple courtyard is already beginning its daytime activity. Stone surfaces are warming beneath the sun. Servants and attendants move quietly through familiar routines. The visitor waits until they can speak with someone who knows the appropriate words. Perhaps the person describes a dream. A particular animal appeared. Someone who had died appeared. A strange place was visited. Or perhaps the dream itself is difficult to explain. The specialist listens. For the Egyptians, dreams could sometimes be treated as meaningful experiences, and surviving sources include dream interpretations and protective formulas, but interpretation was not necessarily simple fortune-telling. A dream could have many possible meanings depending upon circumstances. The important point is that the dreamer did not have to face the uncertainty alone. Someone possessed knowledge. Someone knew the names of protective powers. Someone could provide words to recite. Someone could recommend an object to keep nearby. This offered reassurance. The priest or ritual specialist did not need to prove that the dream had come from a supernatural being. The act of responding to it could itself restore a sense of order. Imagine the specialist preparing a small ritual. Perhaps a vessel of water is brought forward, perhaps incense is used, perhaps a written formula is recited. The exact practice would depend upon the situation and period. Nothing needs to happen quickly. The specialist speaks carefully. The visitor listens. The anxiety surrounding the dream begins to loosen. For an ancient person, this kind of encounter could be deeply comforting. The night had created uncertainty. The ritual provided structure, and structure was important within Egyptian religious thought. The Egyptians placed enormous value on order, balance, and the maintenance of a stable relationship between the human world and the divine. A disturbing dream could feel like a small disruption within that order. A protective ritual offered a way to respond. There were also specialized texts containing magical formulas intended to guard people against harmful forces, illnesses, and supernatural dangers. Some were written down on papyrus, while others may have been transmitted through learned traditions. The written word itself could become part of protection. A formula might be spoken, it might be written, it might be placed near the person who needed it. The boundaries between reading, speaking, ritual action, and religious belief could become beautifully complicated. Back at home, the person might return carrying more than an answer. They might carry a renewed feeling of safety. The same room would still be there. The same sleeping mat, the same wooden headrest, the same darkness would eventually arrive, but the sleeper would now know that a disturbing dream had been given a place within the larger order of things. That mattered, because sometimes the most frightening part of a nightmare is not the image itself, but the feeling that nobody understands what happened. For an Egyptian who believed that dreams could carry meaning, the existence of ritual specialists offered a quiet response. The night could still contain mysteries, but there were people whose entire lives were devoted to learning how to speak with a world that could not always be seen, and when darkness returned, that knowledge might travel home with the dreamer, quietly waiting beside the sleeping mat until the next uncertain dream arrived. The evening returns once again to the Nile Valley. The day's heat has faded from the mud brick walls, and the household has begun its familiar descent into quiet. The same simple objects are in their places: the woven mat, the wooden headrest, the small lamp, the protective charm, but tonight, the sleeper carries something different into the darkness, a question. What if a dream is trying to say something? Ancient Egyptians did not necessarily believe that every dream contained a divine message. Dreams could arise from many causes, and surviving evidence shows that Egyptians developed different ways of interpreting them. Yet some dreams were treated with unusual attention. The possibility that a god might communicate through sleep gave dreams a special place within Egyptian religious life. Imagine a person falling asleep after a difficult day. Perhaps a family problem has been troubling them. Perhaps they have been waiting for an answer. Perhaps they have visited a temple and prayed for guidance. They close their eyes, the room disappears. Then, within the strange landscape of sleep, a figure appears, a deity, a sacred animal, a temple, a familiar place transformed by impossible details. The dream may last only moments. But when the sleeper wakes, the memory feels unusually clear. This kind of experience could be difficult to dismiss. Egyptian religion was filled with relationships between humans and gods. People prayed, made offerings, visited temples, carried protective objects, and sought divine assistance with problems ranging from illness to family concerns. A dream could become another possible point of contact. The gods did not need to appear physically in the waking world. A dream offered a different route. The sleeping mind became a private setting where a person might encounter an image that seemed to carry authority. Some Egyptian sources preserve evidence of dreams being treated as significant, including accounts connected with royal figures and temple traditions. One famous example concerns the young ruler Thutmose IV, who later described a dream in which the god Harmakhis appeared to him. While he rested near the Great Sphinx, the story was later recorded on what is known as the Dream Stela. According to the inscription, the Sphinx spoke to the sleeping prince and promised him kingship if he cleared away the sand surrounding the monument. Whether we read the story as religious tradition, royal ideology, or a mixture of both, it reveals something important. Dreams could be presented as places where divine authority reached human beings. The sleeping person was no longer simply waiting for morning. They might receive knowledge, or believe they had, and that distinction matters. A dream did not need to be objectively divine for it to influence a person's life. If someone believed a god had spoken to them, the experience could affect their decisions, emotions, and behavior. The dream could become part of their personal story. Perhaps the sleeper woke before dawn and remembered a particular word. Perhaps they saw a sacred animal standing beside a river. Perhaps a god appeared silently and simply looked at them. The details might be impossible to verify, yet the feeling could remain powerful. In the quiet hours before sunrise, a person might sit beside the sleeping mat and replay the dream again and again. Was there a meaning hidden inside it? Should something be done? Should a priest be consulted? Should an offering be made? The questions themselves could keep the dream alive. This is where sleep became especially interesting within Egyptian culture. A person could enter the night carrying ordinary worries, and return carrying something that seemed to belong to the gods. But there was also uncertainty. Not every dream was necessarily a blessing. A dream might be confusing, it might be frightening, it might appear contradictory, and if dreams could carry messages, then someone needed to understand how those messages should be read. The Egyptians developed traditions of dream interpretation, suggesting that dreams were not always treated as straightforward predictions. Symbols could have meanings. Events could be read in different ways. The dreamer might need guidance, so the morning after an unusual dream did not necessarily bring immediate certainty. Instead, it could bring another quiet question. What had the sleeper actually seen? The Nile moved outside the house. The first light touched the eastern sky, and somewhere between faith, memory, and imagination, a private dream could become something larger, a message waiting to be understood. The dream has been remembered, but remembering it is only the beginning. For an Egyptian who believed that dreams could sometimes carry meaning, the next question could be much more difficult. Was the dream telling you something? Not every unusual image needed to be treated as an omen. Dreams could be strange, confusing, and completely ordinary. A person might dream about food because they had gone to bed hungry, or about a familiar place simply because they had spent the day there. But some dreams could feel different. They arrived with a particular weight. Perhaps the dreamer woke before dawn with the memory of a darkened doorway, an unfamiliar animal, a sick relative, or a sacred figure still vivid in the mind. The image might seem too precise to dismiss, so the dreamer remembered it, and once remembered, it could begin to influence the morning. Ancient Egyptian dream interpretation was not necessarily based on the idea that every dream predicted the future in a simple way. Surviving evidence suggests that dreams could be interpreted through symbolic associations, with certain dream events understood as favorable or unfavorable signs. One of the most fascinating examples comes from a surviving Egyptian dream book, preserved on papyrus and associated with the village of Deir el-Medina. the text lists different dreams and gives interpretations for them. Its existence tells us something wonderfully ordinary about ancient people. They had questions about dreams, they wanted patterns, they wanted someone to explain why one dream might be considered fortunate while another carried a darker meaning. Imagine an Egyptian worker waking before sunrise. The household is still asleep. He sits quietly on the edge of his sleeping mat. The dream returns. He remembers seeing something unusual. He cannot decide whether it matters. Perhaps he has heard older relatives discuss dreams before. Perhaps someone once told him that particular images could carry warnings, so he keeps the memory carefully. Later, he might speak about it. That conversation could change the emotional character of the dream. What began as a strange nighttime image becomes a question. What if it meant something? This is where a dream could become psychologically powerful without needing to be frightening. Once an interpretation had been attached to it, ordinary events during the day might suddenly seem connected. A delayed boat, an argument, a sick animal, a visitor arriving unexpectedly. Any of these could appear to confirm what the dream had suggested. The human mind is very good at finding connections, especially when something already feels important. Ancient Egyptians were not somehow immune to this. They lived in a world where signs, symbols, divine powers, and religious meanings were woven deeply into everyday life. A dream could therefore become one more piece of information to consider, but the response was not always panic. A warning could be met with another action. A person might seek protection, they might consult someone knowledgeable, they might perform a ritual, they might make an offering, or they might simply remain cautious. This distinction is important because ancient Egyptian protective traditions were often practical in their emotional purpose. The goal was not necessarily to become terrified of every dream, it was to know what to do when something seemed wrong. Imagine the same sleeper returning home that evening. The dream has stayed with him all day. Now the sun is lowering over the western horizon. The fields are turning bronze. His family is preparing the evening meal. Nothing terrible has happened. The household remains exactly as it was. Still, the dream is there in the back of his mind. When darkness arrives, he looks toward his sleeping place. The familiar mat seems unchanged. The headdress waits where it always does. The amulet remains beside it. He may feel a little more cautious than usual. Then he remembers something reassuring. The Egyptians possessed traditions for responding to uncertainty. A dream could be interpreted, a warning could be answered, protection could be sought, and the night did not have to become a source of endless fear simply because the sleeping mind had produced an unsettling image. Perhaps the dream really was a message, perhaps it was only a dream. The ancient Egyptian world did not always demand that those possibilities be separated immediately. Sometimes the mystery itself was allowed to remain, and as the evening shadows lengthened across the Nile Valley, the remembered dream followed its owner quietly toward another night, carrying its unanswered question like a small stone in the hand. The dream has followed the household quietly into another evening. Outside, the Nile Valley is losing its light again. Inside, the smallest members of the family are preparing for sleep. For an adult, darkness might be explained through habit. For a child, it could feel much larger. A familiar courtyard could become strange after sunset. The doorway leading outside could seem deeper than it had during the afternoon. Ordinary sounds could take on unfamiliar meanings, a bird calling from a rooftop, a dog moving through the street, wind brushing against reeds, the creak of a wooden door. None of these sounds needed to be dangerous, but a child did not always know that. Ancient Egyptian families lived with many of the same childhood fears that appear across human history. Children needed reassurance before sleep, and adults had their own ways of providing it. Protective objects were especially important in connection with children. Amulets could be worn or kept nearby, and protective deities were associated with vulnerable members of the household. Among the most recognizable was Biz. Unlike the idealized human forms used for many Egyptian gods, Biz had a distinctive appearance, often shown with a broad face, short body, prominent features, and a posture that made him seem unusually close to ordinary domestic life. His associations included protection, childbirth, children, music, and the household. For a child frightened by darkness, a protective figure like this could have offered something simple. A familiar presence. Imagine a small Egyptian room at night. A child lies awake on a woven mat. The rest of the family is already settling down. The child listens to the darkness. A sound comes from outside. The child turns toward the doorway. Nothing is there. Still, sleep does not arrive. An older sister or mother notices. She sits down nearby. Perhaps she adjusts the linen covering. Perhaps she speaks softly. The child looks toward a small protective object near the sleeping place. The room has not changed. The darkness remains. But now someone is awake beside them. That alone can make the night seem smaller. Children also lived much closer to adults in many ancient households than the separate bedrooms familiar to modern families. Sleeping arrangements depended on the size and wealth of the home, the number of family members, and the particular circumstances. Privacy was limited. That could be uncomfortable in some ways. But at night it also meant that a frightened child was rarely far from another person. A parent might be sleeping only a short distance away. A sibling could be beside them. The sound of another person's breathing could become part of the nighttime environment. There was reassurance in that ordinary rhythm. The child might eventually close their eyes. Then a dream could begin. And dreams were another source of uncertainty. A frightening dream could cause a child to wake suddenly, perhaps calling for a parent. The adult might not know exactly what the child had seen. There was no need to. The important thing was to restore calm. A hand placed gently on the child's shoulder, a quiet voice, a familiar protective object, perhaps a few words remembered from religious tradition. Then the child settles again. The household returns to silence. These small moments rarely appear in monumental Egyptian history. Kings left inscriptions, temples left carved walls, tombs preserved elaborate images, but childhood itself was usually much quieter. It lived in gestures, a mother smoothing a child's hair, a father checking a sleeping mat, an older sibling whispering after hearing a strange sound, someone keeping a small lamp burning a little longer than usual. These details reveal another side of ancient Egyptian life. Fear did not always require a grand supernatural explanation. Sometimes darkness was frightening simply because you were young, and that feeling needed no translation. The night outside continued to expand. The village became quiet. The stars appeared above the Nile. Inside the house, the child finally grew still. The protective figure remained nearby. The adults continued with their own quiet preparations. Eventually, breathing became slow and regular. The child's fear had not been defeated by some dramatic act. It had simply faded beneath the warmth of familiarity. And as the sleeping household settled deeper into the night, the smallest sleeper discovered one of the oldest comforts humans have ever known. Someone was nearby, and the darkness did not have to be faced alone. The child has finally fallen asleep. The room is quiet again, but one small flame remains awake, an oil lamp. Its light is modest. It does not illuminate the entire room. Instead, it creates a small circle of warmth against the mud brick wall, leaving the far corners dim and indistinct. In ancient Egypt, this kind of light was precious. artificial illumination depended largely on oil lamps, and keeping one burning through the night required fuel and attention. Oil was not something to waste casually, particularly for ordinary households, yet there were moments when a little extra light could feel worthwhile. Night was easier to navigate when you could see. A lamp could help someone find the doorway. It could reassure a child. It could allow a parent to check on a sleeping family member. And, within a world where darkness itself could be associated with uncertainty and supernatural danger, the flame could carry a meaning beyond simple practicality. Imagine an Egyptian household preparing for bed. The evening meal is finished. The children are settling down. An adult checks the lamp before lying down. The wick is adjusted. A small amount of oil remains. The flame grows slightly brighter, then it steadies. The person pauses for a moment. The light reaches the sleeping mat. It catches the edge of a wooden headrest. A small amulet beside the bedding becomes visible. Everything is familiar. Everything is where it should be. Then the adult lowers the flame slightly. The household settles. Perhaps the lamp is left burning for a while longer, not necessarily because someone expects a supernatural visitor to appear the instant the flame disappears. There were practical reasons to keep a light available. Egyptian homes could be dark after sunset. A person waking in the night would have difficulty moving safely without illumination. There were uneven floors, steps, doorways, household objects, children sleeping close together. Animals might also be nearby. A small lamp could prevent a very ordinary nighttime accident, but the psychological effect was just as important. Darkness removes visual information, light restores some of it. The difference between the two can be surprisingly powerful. A corner that looks mysterious in complete darkness becomes simply a wall when touched by flame. A strange shape becomes a basket. A shadow becomes a doorway. A noise can be investigated. The lamp does not eliminate uncertainty. It simply gives the eye something to work with. This mattered in a culture where the unseen world had a place within religious thought. Light itself carried powerful symbolism in Egyptian religion. The daily journey of the sun was central to ideas of renewal and cosmic order. Each morning, daylight returned after the darkness of night. A household lamp was obviously not the sun, but its small flame could still feel comforting within the larger rhythm of darkness and light. Imagine waking in the middle of the night. Your eyes open slowly. For a moment, everything is unfamiliar. Then you notice the faint glow. The lamp is still burning. You recognize the room. The sleeping family is nearby. The protective object remains beside the mat. Nothing has changed. You lie back down. The flame moves gently. Its light touches the wall, then withdraws, then returns. Perhaps the lamp was not always kept burning until morning. Fuel had a cost, and household routines varied. Some nights it might be extinguished early. On other occasions, a family might allow it to continue longer. The important point is not to imagine every Egyptian home glowing through the entire night. It is the small decision to preserve a little light when darkness felt particularly uncertain. For a child, that light could be reassuring. For a parent, it offered visibility. For someone troubled by dreams or nighttime fears, it created a familiar point in the room. And for a culture deeply aware of the symbolic relationship between darkness and renewal, even a tiny flame could seem meaningful. Eventually, the oil would run low, the flame would shrink, the room would become darker, but by then, the household might already be deeply asleep. The little lamp had done its quiet work. It had illuminated the familiar world for a few more hours, and sometimes, when people are afraid of what they cannot see, simply being able to see a little farther is comfort enough. The little lamp continues to burn. and around it the household follows a rhythm that has been repeated countless times. Nothing dramatic happens. That is what makes the moment worth noticing. Before sleep, there were things to finish. A doorway needed checking, children needed settling, objects had to be put away, a mat had to be arranged, perhaps a protective charm was placed nearby, perhaps a few quiet words were spoken. Bedtime was not a single ritual shared by every Egyptian. Household customs varied with period, wealth, location, family tradition, and personal belief. Still, the practical routine of preparing for night can be imagined through the ordinary objects and spaces that have survived. Picture a home near the Nile as evening deepens. The day's final meal has been eaten. A clay vessel is carried toward the wall. A basket is moved out of the walking path. Someone folds a piece of linen. Another person checks on a child. Outside, the courtyard has become cooler. The household gradually contracts into its sleeping spaces. For the Egyptians, the night was part of a larger cycle. The sun had traveled across the sky and was now disappearing in the west. The darkness that followed was familiar, even if it carried its own uncertainty. The household therefore needed to make the transition from day to night. This transition was partly practical. Food needed to be protected. Animals might need checking, doors and entrances had to be secured, tools had to be placed where they would not be damaged, water vessels needed to remain accessible. These small actions were the ancient equivalent of preparing a home before turning in. Then came personal preparation. People washed, clothing could be adjusted or removed, hair might be arranged. A sleeping place was prepared. A person who had spent the day working outdoors would finally settle onto the woven mat. The body knew that the day's movement was ending. For children, the process could be slower. Someone might need to remind them to lie down. A child could ask another question, then another. An older sibling might whisper something from the darkness. A parent might answer quietly. Eventually, even the question stopped. The sleeping area itself could carry signs of personal belief. A small amulet might be nearby, a protective figure could be present. Certain objects could be kept close because their owners considered them useful or meaningful. These items did not necessarily form a formal ceremony. They were simply part of the household environment. This is an important distinction. Ancient Egyptians were not performing elaborate religious rituals every time they went to sleep. Most people had ordinary lives. The farmer who returned exhausted from the field still needed rest. The craft worker who had spent hours shaping wood or stone wanted nothing more complicated than lying down. The mother caring for several children probably had little interest in creating a lengthy ceremony. Once everyone was finally quiet, yet ordinary actions could still exist alongside religious beliefs. That is where bedtime becomes interesting. A person could place an amulet beside the sleeping mat almost automatically. A protective phrase could be remembered from childhood. A lamp might be left burning for a little while. None of these actions needed to feel extraordinary. They belonged to the rhythm of the home. The household itself became a place where practical life and religious ideas overlapped. As the evening grew darker, the final movements became slower. A person carried away the last bowl. Someone covered a vessel. A child curled beneath linen. An adult checked the doorway one final time. Then the family members settled into their places. The room changed character. During the day, it had been a place of conversation, food, work, and movement. At night, it became a place of stillness. The oil lamp made the walls appear softer. The woven mats disappeared beneath sleeping bodies. The familiar sounds of the household became quiet breathing. Outside, the Nile continued moving without concern for human schedules, and inside, the Last awake person eventually lowered themselves onto the sleeping mat. Perhaps they paused for a moment. Perhaps they looked toward the small lamp. Perhaps they touched the protective object beside them. Then the eyes closed. The rituals of bedtime were complete. Nothing had been announced. No great ceremony had taken place. The transition had happened through a collection of tiny gestures, the kind of gestures that rarely enter history books, yet once made up the ordinary evenings of countless ancient Egyptian homes. The household is quiet again, but not every night ends with peaceful sleep. Sometimes the body refuses to settle. A sleeper turns from one side to another. The head feels hot. The breathing becomes uneven. A child wakes crying. Someone complains of pain in the morning and cannot remember when it began. For an ancient Egyptian family, such disturbances could be understood in several different ways. Some causes were practical and physical. Others belonged to the religious and magical world. Illness was a familiar part of life, and Egyptian medical traditions were surprisingly detailed. Healers recorded symptoms, prepared remedies, treated wounds, and attempted to understand conditions affecting the body. Yet medicine did not exist in complete isolation from religion. A person could be treated with herbs and physical remedies while also receiving protective words or magical practices. The boundaries were not always clear. Imagine an Egyptian woman waking during the deepest part of the night. Her body feels uncomfortable. She turns beneath the linen covering. The woven mat beneath her offers little relief. The room is warm. Her throat feels dry. She reaches toward a nearby vessel and drinks. Then she lies back down. For several minutes, sleep does not return. Her family continues sleeping around her. The oil lamp has nearly gone out. The woman closes her eyes again, but her thoughts remain active. If the discomfort continues into the following day, someone may wonder what caused it. Perhaps she ate something that did not agree with her. Perhaps she has been working too hard. Perhaps she has caught an illness. But within the religious imagination of ancient Egypt, there were other possibilities. Supernatural forces could be blamed for certain forms of sickness or disturbance. Some magical texts contain protective formulas against harmful beings and conditions associated with illness. The idea was not necessarily that every headache or fever came from a demon. Rather, supernatural explanations could exist alongside practical observations of symptoms. Sleep itself could therefore become part of the explanation. A person who repeatedly woke during the night might believe something was interfering with rest. A child experiencing frightening dreams might seem unusually vulnerable. Someone who became sick after several nights of poor sleep could wonder whether the disturbed nights were connected to a larger problem, and once an explanation had been found, people could respond to it. A healer might prepare a remedy, a ritual specialist might recite a protective formula, an amulet could be worn, a family member might offer prayers. The response could involve several approaches at once. This mixture tells us something valuable about ancient Egyptian thinking. They were not forced to choose between physical and spiritual explanations in the modern sense. The body was real, so were the gods. So were magical forces. All could exist within the same understanding of the world. Consider a child who has been waking repeatedly. The parent notices that the child is restless each night. The child complains of strange dreams. Perhaps the family places a protective object nearby. Perhaps a familiar formula is spoken before sleep. Perhaps a healer is consulted if the symptoms continue. Then, after several nights, the child finally sleeps deeply. The family may never know exactly what caused the problem, but the improvement itself becomes meaningful. The room feels peaceful again. The child's breathing is steady. Morning arrives without crying. For the family, that is enough. There was also a practical reality behind all of this. Poor sleep affects the body. A person who repeatedly wakes becomes tired. A tired worker may perform tasks less carefully. A tired parent has less patience. A sick person may recover more slowly. Ancient Egyptians did not need modern sleep science to observe that rest mattered. They could see the effects in ordinary life. A restless night could leave someone exhausted by sunrise, and when sunrise meant work, farming, construction, cooking, fishing, or caring for children, exhaustion was not a small inconvenience. It could change the entire day, so the desire for peaceful sleep was not merely religious. It was deeply practical. The household needed its people restored by morning, and when illness disturbed that rhythm, Egyptians reached for whatever forms of knowledge and protection were available. Sometimes that meant medicine, sometimes ritual, sometimes both. As night returned over the Nile Valley, the sleeping mats waited once again. The hope was simple enough, that the body would settle, the mind would quiet, and morning would arrive without another restless awakening. By now, the household has settled into darkness, but not every Egyptian experienced the night in quite the same way. The Nile Valley connected people through the same river, the same seasons, and the same rising sun, yet wealth could change almost everything about the hours between sunset and dawn. For a wealthy Egyptian, sleep might take place inside a larger home with several rooms, servants nearby, better quality linen, more carefully made furniture, and objects specifically designed for comfort and protection. For a laborer or poorer family, the sleeping space could be much simpler: a woven mat, a basic covering, a plain headrest, if one was available, perhaps a small lamp using only a modest amount of oil. The difference was not merely about luxury, it was about space. Imagine entering a prosperous Egyptian household after sunset. The walls are substantial. There are several rooms. The sleeping area is separated from the busiest parts of the home. A servant may still be awake somewhere nearby. A well-made wooden headrest rests beside a sleeping place. The linen is fine and carefully arranged. Small containers hold perfumes or oils. Protective amulets and household objects occupy familiar positions. The room feels ordered, quiet, private, at least by ancient standards. Now move only a short distance away, and the atmosphere may be very different. A poorer household might have fewer rooms and less separation between sleeping, cooking, working, and storing belongings. Several family members could sleep close together. The same room might serve different purposes during the day and become a sleeping space at night. There would be less room to withdraw from the sounds of the household, less space for individual possessions, less oil to waste on unnecessary illumination. Yet there was another side to this. Crowded sleeping arrangements could also provide companionship. A child frightened by darkness was not necessarily alone. A parent might be only an arm's length away. Several people could hear one another breathing. The sounds of sleep became part of the household itself. For wealthy families, greater privacy could be comfortable, but it could also mean greater separation. This difference is easy to overlook when we imagine ancient Egypt through the surviving monuments. Much of what remains archaeologically visible comes from people with enough resources to leave durable objects behind. Stone tombs survive, decorated coffins survive, fine furniture survives. Ordinary sleeping mats often do not, so the archaeological record can make ancient life appear wealthier than it actually was. Most Egyptians were farmers, laborious, craftspeople, servants, traders, and members of ordinary households. Their nights were probably far less elaborate than the grand tomb paintings might suggest. A worker returning from a long day in the fields did not need a decorated chamber to understand the value of sleep. He needed somewhere to lie down. His body had already made the argument. Imagine his evening. The day's heat has disappeared. His hands are dusty. His shoulders ache from work. He enters the household. Someone has prepared food. The children are settling down. There is little ceremony. The sleeping mat is waiting. He lowers himself onto it and exhales. Nearby, someone adjusts a lamp. The flame is small because oil costs something. The room is not luxurious, but it is familiar. That familiarity carries its own comfort. Now imagine a wealthier household at the same hour. A person may have a finer bed, better linen, perhaps a more carefully carved headrest, and additional household attendants. The room may contain perfumes, painted furniture, and objects whose value goes far beyond their practical purpose, yet the basic act remains exactly the same. The eyes close. The body becomes still. The sleeper waits for morning. This is one of the quiet ironies of ancient history. Social status could determine what surrounded a person during sleep, but it could not completely control what happened inside the sleeping mind. A wealthy Egyptian could still have a nightmare. A poor laborer could still dream of something beautiful. A noble could wake from a strange dream wondering what it meant. A worker could open his eyes at dawn and feel the same relief. The Nile did not care which sleeping mat had been used. Morning arrived over the houses of the wealthy and the crowded rooms of the poor alike. The sun touched painted walls and plain mud brick with the same patient light, and for one brief moment, before work began again, every sleeper shared the same ancient privilege, the quiet discovery that they had made it safely through another night. The first light has already touched the houses of the Nile Valley. For a moment, the difference between wealth and poverty disappears beneath the morning sun. But the night leaves behind another question. What did an Egyptian believe was actually happening while the body slept? To understand that, we have to step away from the sleeping mat and enter a world where the boundary between the physical and spiritual was not as sharply drawn as it is for us. An Egyptian could think of a person as more than a body. The human being was understood through several interconnected aspects, including the Ka, the Ba, the heart, the name, and other elements that help define personal existence. These ideas changed over time and differed across religious traditions, but together they reveal something fascinating. Sleep did not necessarily mean that everything about a person simply switched off. The sleeping body remained in the room, but other dimensions of existence could be imagined beyond what the waking eyes could see. The Ba, often represented in later Egyptian art as a human-headed bird, was associated with an individual's personality and movement between different realms. The concept developed over Egyptian history and was especially important in funerary beliefs. It would be misleading to say that every Egyptian imagined the Ba literally flying out of the body every night. Ancient Egyptian beliefs were more complicated than that. Still, the idea of different aspects of the self existing beyond the visible body helps explain why sleep could feel mysterious. Imagine a sleeper lying quietly inside a dark room. The body is still, the breathing is slow, the eyes are closed, yet inside the mind, an entirely different world can unfold. A person can walk through a familiar village, then suddenly stand inside a temple. They can meet someone who has been dead for years. They can speak without moving their lips. They can travel enormous distances without taking a single physical step. The sleeping body has not moved very far at all, but the experience can feel immense. For an Egyptian living within a deeply religious culture, this strange condition could naturally invite spiritual interpretations. The night itself had a sacred dimension. The sun disappeared into darkness each evening and returned each morning. The journey of the sun was connected with ideas of renewal, transformation, and the continuing order of the cosmos. Human beings were part of that larger rhythm. Sleep could therefore be imagined within a world where darkness was not simply empty. There were realms beyond ordinary sight. There were gods. There were protective powers. There were dangers. There were places associated with the dead, and there were dreams. Yet there was also something wonderfully ordinary about sleep. The person became tired. They lay down. They closed their eyes. The body rested. Ancient Egyptians did not need a single explanation that answered every mystery. Different beliefs could exist beside one another. A person could understand sleep physically as rest while also believing that dreams might carry significance. They could accept that the body remained on the sleeping mat while imagining that the self had experiences beyond ordinary waking awareness. This layered understanding made the night richer. The darkness outside the house was not necessarily an empty absence of light. It belonged to the larger cycle of existence. The stars appeared, the Nile continued flowing, the temples became quiet, the sleeper disappeared into unconsciousness for several hours. Then, eventually, awareness returned. Perhaps the first sensation was the cool morning air. Perhaps a bird called outside. Perhaps a family member moved nearby. The eyes opened. The room returned. The journey through sleep was finished, though the dreamer might remember only fragments. One image, one face, a voice without words, a place that never existed. The Egyptians could not observe what happened inside the sleeping mind in the way we can now study brain activity. They had other ways of thinking about the mystery. Religion gave language to the invisible, dreams gave images to the unknown, and sleep itself remained one of the most ordinary mysteries of human life. A person could spend an entire night traveling through experiences that felt enormous, while their body remained almost perfectly still. Perhaps that was part of what made sleep so fascinating. The room stayed where it was, the Nile kept flowing, the stars crossed the heavens. And somewhere inside the darkness, the sleeping mind wandered through a world no waking person could completely follow. The night has nearly completed its long journey. Inside the small Egyptian household, the oil lamp has burned low, leaving only a faint trace of warmth against the wall. The sleeper does not know how many hours have passed. There is no clock beside the mat, no glowing marker announcing the approach of morning, only the gradual change in the air, and somewhere beyond the walls, the first sounds of another day. A bird calls, a distant voice carries across the settlement. Perhaps a vessel moves along the Nile. Then comes the faintest suggestion of light. The sleeper stirs. For a few moments, the world remains blurred. The eyes open slowly. The ceiling is familiar. The wall is familiar. The woven mat beneath the body is real. The wooden headrest is still beside the sleeping place. Morning has arrived, and with it comes one of the simplest forms of relief imaginable. You woke. For an ancient Egyptian, this ordinary event existed within a much larger understanding of renewal. The sun disappeared each evening and returned each morning. The cycle repeated so reliably that it formed one of the central rhythms of Egyptian religious thought. Human beings lived beneath that rhythm. Night was followed by daylight. Darkness gave way to visibility. The stillness of sleep gave way to movement. A person who opened their eyes could begin again. Imagine a woman waking before the rest of her family. She remains still for a moment. The room is quiet. Her child sleeps nearby. The small oil lamp has almost completely faded. She can hear breathing. Everything is peaceful. She slowly sits up. Her feet touch the cool floor. There is no ceremony, no grand announcement, just the ordinary movement of a person returning to the world. She reaches for a water vessel, takes a drink, then looks toward the doorway. The sky beyond it has begun to brighten. The same doorway that seemed dark and uncertain only hours before now reveals familiar shapes: palm leaves, mud brick walls, the pale outline of the river. Daylight changes everything. This transformation would have been especially noticeable in an ancient home where artificial illumination was limited. At night, the room depended on a small flame. At dawn, the entire landscape became visible again. The world did not feel smaller because the darkness had been defeated, it simply became recognizable. Perhaps the sleeper had dreamed, perhaps the dream had already begun to disappear, only fragments remained: a face, a place, a voice, maybe nothing at all. Dreams could vanish quickly after waking, leaving behind only an emotional impression. The person might remember feeling peaceful, or confused, or simply grateful that the night was over. For someone who had feared a disturbing dream, the morning could carry particular reassurance. The protective object remained beside the sleeping place. The family was safe. The body felt normal. The household had survived another darkness. Yet this should not be mistaken for constant terror. Most ancient Egyptians did not spend their lives trembling at bedtime. People adapt. They develop routines. They become accustomed to the darkness. They learn which sounds belong to animals, which belong to neighbors, and which are simply the wind. The mysterious becomes ordinary through repetition. Still, the emotional contrast between night and morning remained powerful. At sunset, the world withdrew. At sunrise, it returned. That cycle was visible every day. The Egyptians watched the sun travel across the sky and disappear beyond the western horizon. They saw it return from the east. The pattern offered a profound image of continuity. Human beings could not control whether every night would end safely, but every morning that did arrive offered evidence of renewal. The household begins to wake. A child moves beneath a linen covering. Someone coughs softly. A vessel is lifted. A door opens. The first sounds of work begin. The night has become part of the past, and perhaps that is why waking can feel so peaceful. Nothing extraordinary has happened. No treasure has been found. No great battle has been won. No king has entered the room. A person has simply opened their eyes and discovered that the world is still there. Outside, the Nile catches the growing sunlight. Inside, the sleeping mat is left behind as the household begins its day. For a few quiet breaths before the work begins, the person stands in the doorway and feels the morning air. The darkness has passed. The ordinary world has returned. And beneath the growing light lies a small truth that needs no inscription on stone. Sometimes waking safely is its own kind of blessing. Morning has taken the place of night. Across the Nile Valley, the first warmth of sunlight settles over mud brick walls, palm leaves, temple courtyards, and the quiet river. Inside the homes, people begin to move again. A child sits up beneath a linen covering. A mother reaches for a water vessel. Someone steps outside to begin the day's work. The sleeping mats are left behind. The wooden headrests remain where they were placed. The small lamps have gone dark, and the objects that seemed so important during the night become ordinary once again. This is how the ancient Egyptian household returned to daylight. Not with a dramatic ending, but with small movements: a door opening, a vessel being lifted, bare feet touching the floor, the first meal being prepared. The night has passed, and perhaps, after all the fears surrounding sleep, this is the quietest part of the story. The Egyptians were not simply terrified of falling asleep, they were living with a mystery that every human being still knows. When we close our eyes, we surrender control. We cannot watch the room. We cannot measure the passing hours. We cannot see what our minds are creating. We simply become still. For the ancient Egyptians, that mystery was surrounded by a rich world of gods, spirits, dreams, protective objects, sacred words, and ideas about death and renewal. A headdress could be practical and symbolic. An amulet could be beautiful and protective. A dream could be forgotten by breakfast, or remembered for years. A small oil lamp could illuminate a room, while also making the darkness feel a little less uncertain. None of these things guaranteed a peaceful night, but they gave people ways to live with uncertainty, and perhaps that is more important. Human beings have always created little islands of reassurance around themselves. A familiar object beside the bed. A whispered word, the presence of another person nearby, a light left burning for a little longer, a morning ritual repeated until it becomes almost invisible. The ancient Egyptians were no different. Their world was separated from ours by thousands of years, but the feeling of lying awake in darkness is surprisingly easy to recognize. You hear a sound, you wonder what it was, you turn beneath the covering, you close your eyes again. Eventually, sleep returns, then morning comes. The great temples of Egypt have survived, the pyramids have survived, statues and inscriptions have survived, but the private experience of falling asleep has mostly disappeared. We cannot know exactly what every Egyptian thought as they lowered their heads onto a mat. We cannot know which dreams visited them. We cannot know whether a mother stayed awake for another few minutes beside her sleeping child. Those moments were too ordinary to be carved into stone, and yet, perhaps that is why they are so moving. History is not made only from kings and monuments, it is also made from people quietly waiting for morning. Imagine one final household now. The day has begun. A small child who was afraid of the darkness is outside in the sunlight. The protective amulet that rested beside the sleeping mat has been picked up and worn again. The wooden headdress waits in the empty room. A little later, the family will become busy. The fears of the night will be forgotten beneath the ordinary demands of daylight. Then evening will return. The sun will move westward. Shadows will lengthen across the fields. The Nile will become darker, and once again, someone will prepare a sleeping place. Perhaps the same quiet words will be spoken. Perhaps the same small lamp will glow. Perhaps someone will look toward the darkness and feel that familiar uncertainty. Then the eyes will close. For the ancient Egyptians, night was never simply an absence of daylight. It could be a passage, a mystery, a place of dreams, a time of vulnerability, and eventually, a doorway toward renewal. But every night also carried another possibility: rest. The kind that asks nothing from you, the kind that allows the body to become heavy and the thoughts to grow distant. So let the Nile continue its slow journey beneath the stars. Let the mud brick houses become quiet. Let the final lamps fade. Somewhere in that ancient darkness, an Egyptian sleeper has already found a comfortable position and closed their eyes. There is nothing more they need to do, and as the centuries fall silent around that forgotten room, perhaps the gentlest thought is simply this: the night passed, morning came, and for a little while, everything was at peace.